We are recording. Hi, Rez.
Hey, hi Regina. So we should use our regular names.
Let's use our
So
regular names.
yeah,
Wait,
yeah.
do we have other? Well, what were you thinking of calling me?
I don't know. We could. There's all. I
Yeah,
mean, you have other names.
Elf
Everyone has other
Queen.
names. It's the
But
Bay Area.
do you have another name? Wizard or something?
Um, I don't know that it's nothing really like stuck. You know,
Okay.
people have called me other things, but
Cuddle something?
Mr. Cuddles. Yeah.
Mr. Cuddles. Yeah. No, we should use our real names. Yeah. It doesn't seem like we have a solid option for our other names.
Okay.
Oh, Mr.
So
Khan.
yeah. Well,
Diplomat Khan.
Doctor. It's Doctor Khan. It's not
Dr.
Mr.
Khan.
Khan.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. So, yeah, so we are gathered here today to talk about the theme of ancient future technology. What is that, and how can it help us here in 2020 in the modern world? But before we do that, I want to tell everyone where we met, because right now you're sitting in my apartment in Silicon Valley. What? And I'm sitting here in Florida in my mom's house, and I'm really enjoying seeing my painting and my pink furniture behind you.
Mhm.
But we met at this really cool intentional community in Silicon Valley called Meta Villa. And do you want to say what that is?
Right. So meta, it has multiple meanings. One of them is loving kindness in Pali, and another meaning is kind of an acronym: magic, ecology, technology, and art. And it kind of goes along with the values in the Bay Area, particularly in that community, because it's kind of an intersection point between Silicon Valley tech and art and more holistic consciousness-based practices. Um, and magic, roughly, is kind of all of the mystical experiences that we have that we seek, and a lot of the philosophy that goes along with that, like sacred geometry and things like that.
Which the house
So,
is full of.
which is
It,
full of, yeah,
it's an
yeah, yeah,
amazing, beautiful mansion with all this psychedelic art, Burning Man art inside of it.
right,
Very special place.
right. So that is where we met, and we lived there as roommates for how long was that?
You know, I think I technically lived there for maybe 2 months or three, but
Uh-huh.
I feel like I was solidly there for like a year, that we were both in that community for
Right,
a year
right.
when I was
Yeah,
living
we're both in
down
the
the street
community for a
as
year.
well. And that community is really special. What I like about it is, yes, all of those things you said, but there was this spirit of playfulness and silliness and absurdity that was infused throughout everything. And we've shared so many like weird late night mansion, like unicorn onesie cuddle parties and jam sessions and sound healing with five gongs, and being up at 1 a.m. like cuddling on the giant beanbag by the fire, having an amazing conversation. That's like what I associate with me and you, and like the high points of our
Mhm,
relationship.
mhm.
And so that's what inspired me to sit down today and have this conversation and see what happens.
Yeah, and I really feel like it's like a family, we all live together in a house and do things together, and so it's interesting, that's how family is playing out sometimes, chosen family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's already kind of getting into one of the things I had on my list to talk about with ancient future technology, which is the importance of community or tribe. And so I think we'll circle back around to that later. But first, I would like you to share a little about your background, because what I know about you is you're a physicist and you're also a spiritual practitioner, that you've studied and practiced Buddhism, and even, to my understanding, have some in your lineage, in your background, and that you've also been doing research recently in a different line.
Mhm, mhm. Right. What do you mean in a different? Oh, like the most recent research that I'm working on?
Yeah. So we can.
Yeah, yeah. So, I I kind of come from a multicultural background. I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Bangladesh and raised Bengali American. So I was raised speaking Bengali, and um, along with all of the kind of cultural traditions associated with that. Um, there's different New Years. There are different events and things that you do. Like you're always in, uh, at Bengali parties, people get together and they read poetry, they um, play music, do drama, and
It's so cool. I love that.
so yeah, it's interesting. And the kind of the difference though in terms of worldviews and belief systems, it's quite different. The Western worldview and the traditional Bengali worldview. And so between those two, I was getting like radically different messages about values and beliefs. My family, they basically, my parents are Muslim, and so they raised us Muslim, and particularly in the Bengali variety, where there's a lot of Sufism and things like that in there. But this difference led me to really try to like pursue things on my own in terms of investigating, because it's not like I could just choose one belief system and be comfortable with it, because I was getting different messages from
That's so
the community
interesting.
around. And
I think that's maybe why we get along so well, because my background is
yeah,
I was raised by a Christian dad and a Jewish mom who was
right,
basically atheist agnostic. So same, very different
yeah,
messages. And also with the Christian fundamentalist Christian father, very different messages than mainstream society and like
right,
friends. So it does
yeah,
develop a certain type of person that's like the seeker. And for me, my path has been like studying many different traditions, immersing myself for like a year or two or five, and then studying another one, and then just comparing that data as
mm,
I grow
mm,
and develop
mm.
through like personal immersion and experience.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I was thinking about that, because for you as well as for me, I think we both kind of forged our own path in a way, because that's just what you do when you're not fully comfortable with these. At least some people do, and we've both taken it, to a very invested a lot of time and energy into it. So we've taken it pretty far, and then you can go and you can share that with people. You can share that with um, anybody who is interested. And I mean, I think that's true of anybody. Once you learn something, that's what you can teach. That's what you can share. Um, and it's just interesting when it's very a unique thing that happens to be um, your approach, and it gives you a lot of insight when you have these different perspectives, and you can kind of bridge the gap between them.
Totally. Yeah. And it's making me think of like another topic I had wanted to bring up today, which is cultural appropriation. And so to start that conversation, I'll say I went to a Zoom wedding over the weekend, and it was a Jewish wedding, both of them raised
Mm,
Jewish. And just seeing it was like all their families and uncles and aunts, and doing a traditional Jewish wedding with the blessings that like their parents had done and their parents before, and just seeing the strength of that lineage, and like two people who both came from the same lineage and actually choosing to still walk forward in that, it really highlighted to me very viscerally how I don't have that experience, because all of the for the most part, the traditions that I have most strongly resonated with were not the lineages of my own ancestral people,
mm, mm.
ethnically and culturally. Which isn't to say, someday I might get more into like Gnostic Christianity and Judaism, and I've done a little research, and I am, resonant with some of what I found, but it just hasn't been the things I've spent the most time in. And so, with regards to the dialogue about cultural appropriation, one common position is like that it can be appropriative and problematic to like go into a tradition that isn't that of your ancestors and your own people, because there's wealth within your own ancestral line that would provide like more richness for you without also like taking from someone else's culture. And I've tried that on, and I think there is something there. And personally, my experience is I haven't felt ready or resident enough to really go deeply into like Judaism or mystical Christianity as like my primary path. And so having not felt that that was right for me, then it kind of brings up this other question of like, well, I think the conversation we're having now is just helping me name that there is a path that is, I think, potentially uniquely American or uniquely modern, maybe even a modern Western path that is that of like the synthesist who's like studying these different things because we're not connected to that of our own ancestry, which is also like a very widespread problem here in America for all kinds of reasons, like which gets into another thing of epigenetic trauma and, you know, people that are like here on this land, which was Native American land, and now we're here for a second, third generation, but there's this like root chakra trauma that happens to our ancestors when they left their country, potentially under persecution or traumatic circumstances, that's passed down through our line. So I'm going a little more deeply into that rabbit hole than I meant to right up front, but I just wanted to kind of like put it in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely in the Bay Area, I feel like it's like a cultural, nexus point for that in some sense. There's something happening that I found more so even than other places. But we have a tendency to cluster toward people who are more open-minded toward our own viewpoints. So we might find them elsewhere as well. But
Yeah. And people, I think, that are like, it's like gnosis, like firsthand experience of mystical truth. I think there's like there's a congregation of that
mhm,
type of
mhm,
culture in the Bay Area, and it dances and like pops in and out of different communities that are kind of more rooted in like traditional lineage based ways, indigenous,
mhm,
pagan, whatever. But then there's like a way that we are kind of traveling between them. Like for me, it's like there are people, hundreds of them in my Facebook friends list that, you know, maybe I've seen them at an ayahuasca ceremony or a somatic psychotherapy workshop or a Buddhist meditation or, you know, a Qigong class or a Tantra meditation. And it's like, yeah, it's like the people that are kind of holding these things, but we're not necessarily from any of them. I'm not even from California. You know, part of me could say, oh, well, I'm from the lineage of like modern, you know, California somatic mindfulness
mhm.
based therapy, but I'm from Florida. You know, I was a gentrifier for my 15 years in California, potentially, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think there are pluses and minuses to the different approaches of, if you very diligently approach traditional practices, then you can really take it to a level that um, that gives you more insight and awareness, more perspective than you would if there was just a kind of superficial engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Superficial engagements tend to like bring in elements that often reinforce what we already have, or
Right.
they don't necessarily bring the depth. So there's an argument to being very focused in a particular tradition. But conversely, there's an argument toward kind of a more shamanistic approach. That I'm reading this book by an anthropologist about shamanism, and uh, and he studied it for like his many years, and the idea is that one's personal experiences, one's personal journey is is as far as having mystical experiences is the priority. So it's an approach of you go on some mystical journey, you get the experience, and you bring that back to your community, back to your tribe.
Right.
And that was like a really common thing.
In
um,
traditional shamanic cultures.
Yeah, like I mean, not just yeah in traditional shamanic cultures, but before there were even like larger scale. Um, I would argue before there were larger scale communities. When we were more like split up into like hunter gatherer communities.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I love what you're
so
saying because what you're saying is like, so when I think of shamanism, what comes to my mind are very specific cultural, tribal, indigenous contexts. There's Native American shamanism, there's Mexican, South American shamanism, there's West African shamanism.
mhm,
And what you're saying is even before that, which those are all groups with like a specific lineage and ways that are passed down. You're saying that even
mhm,
before that, the original kind of
mhm.
shaman was the person who's doing something kind of like what we're doing now of like
Yes,
seeking their
yes.
own mystical truth.
Right, right.
That's really
That's
cool.
what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm saying it's like a very basic human thing that we just do. Like if you have a group of people like a tribe, there's going to be somebody there who's more like approaching things in a shamanistic way, and they seem to go a little bit further toward perceptual experiences that are more mystical, and they bring that back in and integrate that into the tribe.
And
So I
the
think
other
it's
thing
it's,
that's
it's a
coming to
very
my mind
natural.
as you're speaking, I thought you were going to say, when you're in a tribe, there's someone there who, I thought you were going to say, who has more experience, right? Like in a tribe, there's an elder who's done it before. And so they have wisdom to pass down to the 20-year-old or
Mhm,
the 40-year-old. And I
mhm,
think for me personally, what I feel is that the reason why I went on this path of the seeker is I didn't really feel I had an elder of that quality. I didn't even learn what that was until maybe 20 years later when I started hearing the definition of an indigenous elder, or in like process work psychology, they talk about the elder in a very specific way as kind of like someone who can hold space for the community and, do it in a certain way. And the idea of the elder in a shamanic context, like the person who sees you when you're little and they're like, oh, that kid is different. They're kind of sensitive. I'm going to take them under my wing and nurture those skills and teach them how to work with their sensitivity.
mhm,
Versus my experience as a sensitive kid was like, well, I have a dad and a grandma who are artists. And so they saw that quality in me of being an artist. And they were elders to me in nurturing my
mm,
artistic, creative ability. But there was no one who had the framework to nurture my sensitivity in terms of developing mystical, metaphysical skills or emotional wellness.
mhm.
Because, there's also this cluster of like parallel between shamanism, mental illness, and creativity.
Mhm.
That's something I've
Yeah,
personally been geeking out on.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I forget who it was. There's this fellow he's responsible for the development of transpersonal psychology. I don't know if he's like the founder or I was listening to a YouTube video the other day. I'll have to go back and check that. But I know that even in the handbook, the DSM, uh, the handbook of uh, mental diagnoses, now they're adding information like about like a spiritual crisis kind of thing,
Spiritual
because
emergency.
spiritual emergencies, right? Yeah. So even in cases where in Western medicine they might think you know it's really something like a mental condition, in the proper context it can be nurtured into um,
Absolutely. Have you read the article,
something
What a
healthy.
Shaman Sees in a Mental Hospital?
No, I have not. No. Yeah.
That is written by Malidoma Somé, who was my teacher for the West African Shamanism, the 2-year training that I did. And it's such an excellent article. I send it to people all the time because it just so clearly paints out. He's like, oh, this person is talking to spirits and they need to be taught how to do it and like not
Right.
medicated, because
Right.
actually if they don't talk to those spirits, like those spirits are going to keep fucking with everybody. And so
Yeah.
that gets us into the space now in our conversation of more of like a spirit based belief
Mhm.
system.
Mhm.
And I wonder if this opens the door to any of like the research you've been doing or what you want to say about that right now.
Well, yeah, I mean that seems to be a big deal in shamanism. That's like one of the fundamental that's an approach that people have is to interact with or see spirits, and that's how they do a lot of things. They'll do like healing or otherwise interact with their environment and their group using this idea of spirits. That seems to be pretty natural. It seems to
And pretty
be
common across cultures. So
right, pretty
like for
common
me,
across
when I
cultures.
think
Right.
about ancient future technology, like before we spoke, I made a little outline of like, what does that mean to me? And what
Mhm.
I wrote was, well, I wrote, first of all, you would define technology. And that's actually
Mhm.
one thing I really liked about Maladoma's training.
Mhm.
The training wasn't called shamanism. I just use that word because it's something that Americans understand. He calls it indigenous African spiritual technology. And he
Mhm.
talks about like the definition of technology. And you as a scientist, you can probably define it better than me, but something about like working with very specific materials in a very specific way to produce like basically repeatable results.
Mhm.
How would you define technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I
Yeah.
leave a lot of things undefined, by the way.
Okay.
Like I use them for kind of poetic,
Mm-hmm.
because like definitions have limits,
It's
basically.
true. Yeah.
Um, but and then I'll just like look it up, and I have looked it up, and it seems it's technology as it's defined according to the dictionary where I looked it up. It's based on science. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that's based on science. It's an application of science. But I don't really know if that's um, the best definition.
Mm-hmm.
I would use it more as it's they're tools that come about
To help
based
you
on
do a thing.
some to help you do a thing, and there's usually some theory behind it. There's some framework
I like that.
for why it works. And that's a little bit more general than it's just based on science, because I don't think they were really thinking about that when they were developing a lot of early technology anyway.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is I feel like I've maybe not developed, but like discovered technology. For example, recently I've been being educated about women's moon cycle, like magic, essentially, how to work with your
Mm,
menstrual cycle in magical ways. Some things I'm being taught, some of them are ancient, some of them are from like modern knowledge of hormonal cycles and whatnot. But then some things I'm just discovering. Like I
mm,
discovered, oh, if I get in the bath right when I first start bleeding and having cramps, I can basically have something kind of like a mini ayahuasca ceremony, just with no medicine, just with my own menstrual cycle. And I've discovered that just because it was like something was hurting and I knew something that would make me feel better. And I
mm,
wasn't really trying to like the problem I was trying to solve was like how to feel better, basically.
mm.
But
Yeah,
then something really
yeah,
cool happened because I'm like, oh, I can download messages from, you know,
yeah,
wherever in the process of trying to make my cramps go away. Like I'm actually having like a full ceremony. That's pretty cool. And so then
yeah.
of course I want to share that with others because it's cool.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think and a lot of this technology is basically designed to quote make our lives better. Something may draw our attention. Some kind of suffering may draw our attention, and then that allows us to figure out that point of focal attention can allow us to develop some form of technology to solve that problem. They're
Yeah.
doing that all the time in the
Just
Bay
like,
Area.
yeah, I know that's every Silicon Valley app developer, right?
Yeah.
And right before our call, I was Googling, my mom found me this article, 10 best online jamming like apps, because
Uh-huh.
I miss
Oh
jam
yeah,
sessions and I
that's
want to
that's
jam with
really
my
important.
friends online,
Yeah,
but latency is a thing. Like with Zoom, you
yeah.
can't really do it. So that's a problem that I'm experiencing that I want someone to solve. I don't want to have to build an app. Some of these things look like the article was like from 2008, although it had been updated. But I went to some websites that just made me really smile because I haven't seen like a hand coded HTML website with a black background and many different colors of 10
Mm.
point Arial font in a long time.
That's cool. Like we should talk about that later.
Okay.
But um Yeah, so like the ancient future technology, this kind of idea, why is it like ancient future? Um, because I feel like we're kind of in a strange transitionary period, and the transitionary period is like um, 10,000 BC to the present. Um,
Okay. So paint a
some
picture for me of what was happening at 10,000 BC, because I'm not great with like history or remembering things.
Yeah, so the I mean the interesting thing is, and this comes back to like basically the stone circles. Um, so when I was visiting England, I visited a lot of stone circles, including Stonehenge, and
So
you
there's
can
lots of
track.
other ones besides Stonehenge that are similar.
Mhm. Yeah, there are many stone circles, as well as just structures like megalithic structures. They were Looks like they were doing something with all of
So it
these.
sounds like technology.
It sounds like technology. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's my point. It sounds like technology, and what's very interesting is if you look at particularly Stonehenge, these are huge, massive stones. They're like 25 tons, and they carried them from Wales. They carried them like hundreds of miles away um, to their current location.
Hmm.
And why would they do that? What
Mhm.
the stones, they had a particular composition. They call them blue stones,
Hmm.
and these blue stones have some, it's like an igneous rock, as well as
What's an
sandstone. There's
igneous
also
rock? What's that mean? That's the name of a stone.
it's like volcanic
Okay. I
igneous
got
rocks.
distracted because I was trying to make eye contact with the webcam. You know that whole thing of
Yeah, I
like,
know. Yeah.
did it
Yeah.
work? Did you feel more connected to me?
I think I did a little bit.
But
Yeah,
I felt less
but it's
connected
still.
to you, and I
I
started
know,
zooming
that's the
out.
problem.
All
That's the
right, I'm
problem.
just gonna keep looking down.
Yeah, that's another technology. That would be good. But
Yeah, that would be really good.
yeah. So anyway, so these stones, they were carried like hundreds of miles. So like, why would they do that? If they were just keeping track of like some astronomical stuff, why wouldn't they just erect something locally? But they really wanted those stones. They
Yeah,
to the point where they're willing to like travel
yeah,
hundreds of miles
yeah. That's
at
big.
and they were doing this like 2300 BC-ish. Uh, this is not modern times that they're building this. But the interesting thing is the culture that built these structures in England. You can track them back because they basically arrived 6000 BC, and they arrived in England 6000 BC, and they didn't look like the typical British, like white British person. They had like darker skin, they're like brown colored, they had brown eyes, and they eventually replaced the hunter gatherers who lived there,
Hmm.
and they replaced them and basically dominated uh, England until uh, roughly 2000 BC. I think they completely replaced them around 4000 BC, and then around 2000 BC, they themselves were replaced by, um, you know, some people from some Dutch people,
Hmm.
uh, roughly from that location that traveled across uh, the the island and eventually took over. I don't. Maybe it was uh, peaceful, maybe it was violent. Nobody knows.
Hmm.
Um, but
So do you know where the people were from that the darker skinned, darker eyed people, where they came
yeah,
from?
so that's what I'm getting to. So they tracked them back, and they followed this journey, starting 7000 BC, that went basically from around Turkey, around it's called Anatolia, and they went westward through the Mediterranean, and they stopped by in Greece. They stopped by some other places, but these are all like very interesting places. Like Greece is involved in a lot of philosophy and development. Everywhere they went, there was some kind of development, and in fact, where they started, that is basically the birthplace of civilization, of agriculture, animal husbandry. You see this kind of
Which is where?
explosion.
Turkey or?
Yeah, it's around Turkey. It's
Mhm.
around the Caucasus Mountains,
Okay.
basically, that mountains area. And there's kind of an explosion of civilization at that point around 10,000 BC. And there you find the most elaborate stone structures like Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, wow. Wait, say that
That are
again. What
just
was it called?
Göbekli Tepe.
How do you spell
Göbekli
it?
Tepe. GOBLEKI space TEPE.
Cool.
So
So we'll
yeah,
Google
look it
that.
up.
Yeah.
It's super fascinating. And so, but and that's 10,000 BC. So from 10,000 BC to 2000 BC, you had this continuity of a civilization. Think about it, it's like 8,000 years, you know, that you had the continuity of this tradition of building these stone structures.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting that they spent that they would consistently do this. So this
Sounds
tells me that,
important.
yeah, it sounds very, very important. So hence ancient future technology, because I think this is one of the things that we're going to rediscover is how this actually works, how this plays into how they operated as a civilization. Because they were very, very.
Do you know what they did with them? What they were used for?
Well, no, I mean not. Well, I have suspicions.
What are your suspicions?
And so you can look at what we do as a society, like right now, like what our instincts are producing in terms of technology. Right this moment, what has been produced? What has been produced is a technology for us to communicate over distances right now.
Right.
So we really, really want to do that.
Yes, we do.
And so so if you had wanted to communicate over distances, there's something called they call them like ley lines or earth energy lines.
I've heard of that.
So if these are somehow connected to locations on the earth, and you could intersect with them using this technology, then
so you think it was from people communicating with other people that had a different stone circle that kind of somehow vibrationally transmitted through the ley lines?
Right. So like, we're doing like broadcasts. We're trying to like broadcast information. Well, what if you could broadcast information as if you were experiencing it like a dream,
I'm going to pause you there because that sounds really interesting. Because what I also want to inject, I'm wondering if you thought this too, when you first started talking about communication, I thought you were going to go the other direction, up the alien route of communicating, because they kind of look like big, they're pointing to the sky. Is that something that entered your mind at all, or?
I suppose it's possible, but this is a culture that spread out, over
because it's a people
very
from,
large.
That's true, right? From the same culture in different geographic regions. That's why you're having that theory.
Out.
It makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I mean,
it was their Zoom, basically.
Yeah, it's their Zoom, right? Because I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like we're trying to fundamentally do something.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't they be trying to do the same? They're advanced.
I like that.
Culture,
that
advanced civilization.
Yeah.
So the question is like, how they do that. What's the natural way to do that? Because the way that we've done it now, this kind of technology, I call it death technology.
Death or depth?
Death technology.
Death.
Yeah, death technology.
Will you do it like this? Death.
Yeah, and I don't mean that in a bad way.
What do you mean it
people
as?
People think of death as bad. It's just that there are different dynamics at play, and this goes back to the idea of like sacred trees. You have the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, and I believe also tree of death.
I haven't heard of the tree of death. Is that a thing, like in texts?
No, I just coined it.
You just coined it. As an aside, there's also one thing I love about you is how you communicate with trees. And that I feel like that was one of our first bonding points, because I also, talk to the trees in my way, and I'll never know exactly what you experience when you're doing that, but just made me picture you like when we've been hanging out and you'll be like, hey, I need to go outside and just be with the trees for a minute. And then you'll go
Yeah.
out and just be with them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a part of my practice. That's part of my practice that I've done for like ever since I was, you know, barely a teen, ever since I was 14. So for decades. And this, I think that the dedication to a practice, that's why I say dedication to a practice
Mhm.
can really help you connect more
Yeah,
to
it
some
deepens.
experience.
Yeah.
It deepens the
Mhm.
experience. And so I keep doing it because it's so um, helpful. So I get a lot out of it. I could go into depth with that,
That'll be the
but
next podcast, talking to the
yeah.
trees. But for now, back to the tree of death. What does that mean to you? You just coined the term.
Yeah, because there is there is a concept that there were many sacred trees, and we don't necessarily know all of them. We in the Bible we're told about the tree of life. It's not just in the Bible; it's also in uh, many of the Mesopotamian cultures. All of these cultures that came out of this early explosion of civilization, and so you have the tree of life, and they have also in the Bible it refers to the tree of knowledge of
Which I've
good
seen
and
more in a
evil.
Kabbalah context, and I haven't gone deep enough to really understand it, but I know
Yeah,
there's a lot there.
yeah, right. Because the ultimately the Jewish tradition comes from
Right.
this very ancient,
Hmm.
uh, you know, knowledge. So
What do you
um,
think the tree of life is? What does that mean to you?
yeah, so this is where I my background is science.
Hmm.
I am a physicist by training.
Hmm.
You know, as soon as I went to the university, I started working with particle accelerators, and then I started doing research on black holes and gravitational waves. And eventually, I moved on to do research on the brain and the technology for brain imaging and brain scanning. And so eventually moved on to like perceptual research. Uh, but my training ultimately is as a physicist, and I as a physicist, one of the concepts that you come across is entropy, which is this rather mysterious phenomenon of particles becoming more and more disordered over time, becoming more and more random. Or at least that's one of the laws of entropy.
Okay.
Um, so this and it's maybe it's not obvious, I don't know if it's completely obvious, but the idea is that on average you will see things tend toward decay if they're isolated. you
Mm,
you, you don't see them spontaneously becoming more ordered.
mm,
They become more and more uh, um, entropic.
hmm.
And so and this is such a useful concept that it's codified in the laws of physics, and you use that to make predictions. So
So how does
for
that connect
example,
back in with tree of life and tree of death?
right, so the the point is that entropy is kind of like death.
Hmm.
it's
Yep.
it's the deterioration of things. And you when you come in contact with something that's entropic, you can, for example, you come in contact with something, a bunch of random particles, then you're more likely to lose your structure. The random particles kind of start hitting the structure, and the whole thing becomes more random.
That's why I
uh,
can't finish a fucking project in San Francisco. I'm much
yeah.
better here in my mother's house where I'm only coming into contact
uh,
with a 70-year-old woman who has the same routine every day.
that's great, that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, yeah. I totally understand.
I know you
um,
do.
yeah, in some sense, this quarantine stuff is, a blessing in disguise.
It is,
It's
absolutely.
so that's the idea. So the tree of death is like all of the things that are dying, that are in contact fundamentally with death, that are becoming more and more entropic. So the question is, where does life come from? And that to me is the tree of life. Where does like structure
I
come from?
see.
Where does order come from?
The tree of life
And
is the answer. Like the structure that's mapped out in tree of life is the answer to the question, where does life come from?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
exactly,
the
exactly.
parallel would be true for tree of death.
Yeah, exactly,
Cool.
exactly.
Neat.
And
What about tree of
right,
knowledge? Same thing structurally? That's where knowledge comes from?
um, in a sense, yes,
Okay.
because like it's this weird thing that we develop that's also fundamental to to being human, is that we pass down knowledge. If we
Mm,
didn't do that, then we wouldn't have science, we wouldn't have any of these things, we wouldn't be able to like
yeah.
build um, smartphones. So the tree of knowledge, it is that tree, but it's referring to our mode of operation. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's the tree of knowledge of binary classification. So
This would be a whole
it's
interesting thing to delve into maybe in another episode of all the three trees and maybe with some
right, the
diagrams.
sacred
Yeah,
trees.
this is
Yeah,
an
yeah,
interesting
yeah,
to
yeah.
me. Yeah, because I don't ever feel like I've really understood it. I've seen like the Kabbalah diagram and then it's mapped with the chakras. I'm like, okay, that I kind of get. And then there's like a bunch of words that I also don't understand. So,
Yeah, and it's really fascinating because it was such an important thing for them to address early on. The ancient Mesopotamians were trying to understand why people die, because
ah,
for them the gods were immortal. They were immortal beings at the time that
mhm.
they that they understood to apparently not die, or at least they didn't die as quickly. And 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 human beings, they seem to die quicker, and they were trying to understand this. They were trying to understand death and decay. So in some sense they were studying the tree of death, and they often refer to this as a denial, a separation from the tree of life.
Hmm.
So even in the Bible story, people are denied the tree of life, but also in the other stories that are not in the Bible, people are denied the tree of life.
Hmm.
um, so
And what's your Buddhist take on why people die?
yeah, so I don't know well, the, in Buddhism there's a concept of impermanence,
Hmm.
that that form, any form is not permanent, and that's basically like a given. You observe it. That's very close to the law of entropy, in my
Hmm.
opinion. So it's close to this scientific concept. So very close to the tree of death.
Yeah, just to insert, one of the things I've been studying recently is a very new therapy technique called recreation of the self. I've told you a little about it before. It was one of the lead Hakomi trainers who did Hakomi therapy for like some decades. And then he saw in every session where people would get to this really almost like a spiritual experience, like a state of rapture through the session, there were these fundamental qualities that he would see them connecting with. And so he created this list of what he calls the absolutes, which he defines as like absolute qualities of existence and the universe. And then on a fractal level, because they're qualities of the universe, they're also qualities of us as humans. And so I have a list of these. And when we do this therapy, it's helping a person connect back in with these qualities. And it's a way of like resourcing them and bringing them out of neural pathways that are not favored experiences, like when people feel depressed or anxious or disconnected from things. We can help them access these qualities to like feel better very quickly. And one of the qualities is change, flow, movement, and another
Mm,
one of them is nothingness. And there's
mm,
also a whole bunch of other ones, but it's just
mm,
making me think of that because this is a psychological tradition, but he doesn't call it a spiritual belief system, but to me it's very resonant. It maps very well over spiritual belief systems that I've
mhm,
engaged with, including
mm.
you know more like Indian tantric kind of ideas of um forget where I was going with that. There was something there, but it's gone.
Yeah, there is this concept in Eastern traditions of kind of bringing in certain energies. So you would bring in a certain energy, and that's certainly an active, practice of mind. The mental quality, the certain perspective that you hold, that can begin to transform things.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think it's a combination of these different qualities, these different energies, and the appropriate application of them that begins to really lead to transformations of the pain points that we're working with.
Yeah.
Um, which is a whole nother thing, but
But it is
but
tying back
it
to
is
the
a
definition of
technology.
technology of
Yeah,
like
yeah,
what can make this hurt
right,
less
right.
or like work better. And I love
Uh-huh.
this conversation. I'm having fun, and I feel like we're like 5 layers in deep. And so I'm kind of like, how can I keep trying to like weave it back, weave it back, weave it back. And so we kind of dived into all of this through the stone circle,
Right.
and that as like the ancient person's Zoom. And so then
Mm-hmm.
we kind of went into the tree of knowledge, tree of life, tree of death, and
Right. So life technology, I believe what we need to work on to discover really is more life technology, because what we're working with now, um,
life
is
technology meaning technology that gives us life, or
no, it's so let me define death technology, and maybe it will
okay.
help explain life technology. So death technology is like, um, the reason I call it death technology is because uh, it 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 depends on predictions predictions over time. So basically, physics, it tries to make a whole bunch of predictions. It tries to
Mm.
construct a model and then predict things over time. And the arrow of time, the direction of time itself, is only determined by one thing,
Hmm.
and that thing is entropy. So it is
I
death. It
see.
is decay.
Interesting. Wow.
Otherwise, you don't know which way is forward or backward. The laws of
Wow.
physics, they don't
Very
care.
interesting. Yeah.
Um, and so if the technology is based on the laws that are based on time, and time is based on death, then ultimately it's all based on how well we can predict things decaying. Like, we're watching things dying and we're making predictions based on it.
Hmm.
Um, so it's like all the experiments are kind of separated from people. You just like
Hmm.
isolate something and then watch how it plays out,
Hmm.
right? Um, it's not entirely true, because you make some predictions in the stars, and to whatever extent there is life in the universe at large, it's not fully isolated.
Mm-hmm.
But all of the basic physics, you try to isolate it as much as possible and remove external interactions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just very interesting. The whole system is
It
based
is.
on making predictions in
Yeah.
these weird environments, and ultimately comes down to predicting things in time, or like comparing it to
Right.
things that are decaying. uh, so that's why I call it death technology. Like, the whole framework is based on that. I'm
Yeah.
not saying it's bad.
No, I love it. I've
Obviously
never heard
it's
anyone
cool.
explain time that way before. That's a very interesting framework.
Yeah. So it is just helpful to learn physics. So I spent a really, really long time doing that before really approaching the spiritual things, so that
Hmm.
I could integrate that well into it.
And that's another
Um,
thing I really like about you. I think it
yeah,
makes it
thanks.
interesting to talk to you about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is, that's what we call death technology. So life technology, then, there are things that have less to do with predictions of how things decay, right? So it's just not based on the framework that we've developed by kind of separating things out and watching how they play
So
out.
give me an example of life technology.
So I mean, basically, shamanism, all of these things where we're directly involved, engaged, where our consciousness is engaging with the system, and in
So
some sense
shamanism,
altering.
magic, alchemy, any of that.
Yeah, all of that stuff. It's conceivable that it's more complex than that, but
Okay.
like, as a very basic model, I'm just dividing things into two, right?
Mhm.
So this
Yeah.
this is tree of knowledge. Even our communication here is tree
Uh-huh.
of knowledge. And so
And
it's
our
not
visual
perfect.
of the two of us on Zoom boxes.
Yeah, yeah. It's technology. So it's not a perfect description. If you delve into life technology, you'll find all kinds of details that aren't fully there. But it's fundamentally it's life interacting with life, with the world,
Yes.
with life. Um,
Beautiful.
and so
Hmm.
it's that injection, and
Hmm.
that dynamic, it begins to change things, and we haven't fully harnessed that. We have uh, begun to do that a little bit in our practices, but it will, I believe that it will be far more amplified by these life technologies that are connected to the earth and these large, um, bulk life forms.
I love this. Yeah, it's making me think of process work, process oriented psychology, which is what I was studying in Portland when I was gone for like over a month. And with process work, the idea, so process work has roots in Jungian psychology, shamanism, and Taoism. And with Jungian psychology also including dream work, which also connects it to like some of the Aboriginal dream time, dream work type stuff. And the idea behind process work is that there's a process that's trying to happen, and in terms of a psychological or like group dynamic application, that like we tend
Mm,
to have these rigid identities and resist a process that's trying to occur. And so it's sort of like
mm,
a set of tools that helps us. They divide it up again binary. They talk about primary process and secondary process, and your primary process is the identity that you identify with primarily, and your secondary is that which is other. And so a lot of the process work interventions are basically taking in like a microdose of the secondary process, that which is other, either through movement or sound or drawing. And when you bring just a little of that in there, then the Taoism comes in because it kind of brings you as a system, whether that's an individual, couples therapy, or like an organization, brings the system more into balance.
mm,
And it's very much like life technology under what you've just
mm,
described. And I know you brought up dream work. You said something about dreaming at the beginning of this call, and this feels like an opportune moment to just share a little bit. The dream work part of process work. So process work has like, there's kind of like art therapy stuff you can do. There's like movement and sound stuff. There's more like analytical talking stuff. And there's dream work. And dream work has always been the most esoteric part of it that I just feel like I have a really hard time understanding. And
mm,
I also met with two friends yesterday from my New Moon women's group, and we're planning a dream work session for ourselves. And so we set the intention, because we've all done dream work kind of from different, similar and also different like communities and traditions. So one of the practices is like dreaming into a question, and
mm,
also doing that as a community. And I remember at the Malidoma, at the West African training, that's something we would sometimes start our day with, would be like sitting in circle and sharing, okay, we're all sleeping here on this property together, we're all in community, what did people dream? And then
mm,
harvesting that for insights for the community. It's like you're going fishing and like bringing something in that's like knowledge that needs to be shared. And that being one example of life technology, another example would be working with stars and the cycles of the moon, the cycles within our own bodies. Like I spent about half my life not knowing how to do that, and almost half my life learning and knowing how to do that. And it's like unimaginable for me to think about going back to a time where I don't consider the stars and I don't consider my moon cycles, and oh, is it a new moon or a full moon? And there's whole fields of farming, biodynamic farming, permaculture, that take these into account in the growing
mm,
of fruits and vegetables as well. But to bring it back to dreams, so we set an intention for this call we're going to lead next week. We're all going to dream into a question together over the week, and then we'll do some active dream work processes during the call to work with that. And I happened to be on another call last night, a really beautiful community of women, different women's community, that are doing womb healing and songwriting together. And we had this elder mentor, guest teacher coming and holding space for our community and sharing about the blood mysteries and how to work with your blood as a prayer, which, as a side note, is also something I learned in the West African tradition. But in that tradition, it's through chicken sacrifice. And so as a bleeding woman, you can do this with your menstrual blood, same thing, DNA, basically, and putting your prayers out. But so we had this like ancestor ceremony, not with blood, just with a Zoom call last night where we were calling in our ancestors and like doing some healing work personally, and also just being with the cultural moment, because yesterday was June 2nd, the day of a lot of protests around the murder of George Floyd by the police, and just a lot of energy in the collective, people feeling a lot of things. So we did some ceremony around that, and I left that with the question of what is mine to do right now, like with regards to this cultural place that we're at and the healing of racism. And so I dreamed on that question, and I just did that by setting the intention before bed, for my ancestors and all my other guides to like show me, you know, whatever I need to see. I asked the question, and I had such an amazing night of dreaming. And I actually, it feels like harvest is the most appropriate term. I harvested a lot of it this morning. Right when I woke up, I typed it into my iPhone so I can remember it. And then later I'll work with some of the most potent images within that and kind of go deeper into what messages they contain. But at any rate, that's an example of like, I see it as like life is operating. I guess when I was bringing up the more like Eastern and Indian philosophy earlier, I'm thinking of kind of like the layers of reality. And so it's like life is operating on all these layers. And when we can start working with these technologies, we're able to participate more fully, essentially. And that brings up another teacher of mine, Zion Cabot, who was in the West African training. His whole thing coming out of that is participation. That's like what he orients his teaching and spiritual community around. So I'm going to stop talking because I've been talking for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. That's that, and the whole thing about being able to connect. This idea of being able to connect is really, it's really critical. So I think that's one of the, you know, the features of life technology is it allows us to connect and exist more in a harmonious balance. And I think a lot of people will be focusing more and more on that as time goes along. And unfortunately, we see you know, events that come from disconnection and separation. You know, things like you know, racism and you know, other forms of discrimination, oppression. All of these things that is coming to the consciousness now. I think it's really a product of this mechanism of civilization that has propagated for so long, for this entire period of time, and is now reaching a transition point. So ancient future technology, you know, like I said, this is kind of it's an interesting period of time that we've been living in. And if the people who had built these ancient technologies, if they were still around, I think it would have played out differently, but it didn't play out like that. And so this goes back to like kind of the myths and the stories they had, because they had this idea of a deluge, like and they commonly translate it as like a flood. But it's this period where like a lot of things were kind of wiped out. There's a lot of collapse, and like if you read some of these ancient Mesopotamian tablets, they talk about all different kinds of creatures or different forms of beings that were alive. And
are you
after that,
the flood, like Noah's Ark flood, or like a different one, or?
yeah, it's Noah's Ark flood.
Okay.
You know, but there are a lot of
There are a lot
So
of
that
those.
story, yeah, that story is like really old. You can find the
Mhm.
story of Utnapishtim and various other. So I'm referring to the entire set of stories that refer to that, because some
Mhm.
of them it's not even water. It's like an ice storm, you know,
Mhm.
or or just like drought. But all of these things happened. If you look at um, there are records of these events, like the 5.9 kiloyear event and the 4.2 kiloyear event. These are events that occurred 4,200 years ago and 5,900 years ago, and they roughly correspond to the region of time that if you track the biblical versions, there are several versions of the Bible that refer to when the flood occurred, and it's like roughly, I don't know, like 5,400 BC to like uh you know
I believe you,
2000
no
BC,
matter what you
2,200
say.
BC. It's
'Cause I have
rough.
no idea.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, you can look it up,
I could Google it,
but
but I'm not going to right now.
right, there are different versions of the Bible, though, and they've made calculations based on them, so it's a range. But it roughly corresponds to that period of time where there was like geologic change, and a lot of civilizations were collapsing. The Egyptian civilization survived because they were able to like cluster around the Nile, but they became more focused as a civilization. The elements of civilization became more focused. They were more probably more stratified, and their pharaohs became like gods, and
Are you
you
saying
know
they became more
uh,
focused around the deluge, like after, or is that a separate thought?
well, yeah, they became more because a lot of civilizations collapsed, like
Mhm.
during the deluge. There were civilizations in India like Mohenjo-daro, and um, and in Mesopotamia, a lot of those civilizations collapsed. The early uh, um, the early cities, Eridu and these other cities, they collapsed. But Egypt did a little bit better because the Nile River was consistent for them, but it changed
Mhm.
their way of life. They became more focused around the Nile River. Um,
And why did you bring up the deluge? I'm wondering if you're about to say that we're in one now.
yeah. Well, why did I bring up? Well, it wasn't because of that. Oh, it was because they referred to after the deluge, um, this the advisors to the kings, and these in some of these stories were referred to as umanu, or craftsmen,
Hmm.
and they were the people who were left over after the deluge. And even the
Ah,
Bible, it says like the Nephilim were wiped out, like all these different, like very like fanciful um, ideas of different kinds of people were like wiped out, but like
hmm,
umanu survived, the craftsmen, and we built all these technology um,
interesting.
as a result. So the,
So
this
creative
is
people have some kind of evolutionary advantage for survival. Cool.
yeah, yeah. So that's the rough idea there. Um, Whether we're in a deluge right now, that's a good question. And in a sense, yes, because if you look at the records, they um, you know in the old stories of the deluge, they talk about a series of things. They talk about like droughts, and we have had like fires.
Yes.
You know, we've
Yeah,
had
I was living in California a few years ago. I remember those
yeah,
fires. It was not fun.
yeah, that and even in Australia we've
Yeah, I
seen
mean the
these
huge one
these
in
kinds.
Australia this year, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, arguably, COVID-19,
Plagues.
like plagues. Yeah. So
So it's
all of these
droughts,
things.
plagues,
Uh-huh.
floods, right?
Uh-huh.
Like natural
Yeah.
disasters,
Right.
hurricanes,
So
typhoons.
yeah, these are all the things they talk about historically. So we're
Did they have
coming back.
they didn't really talk about like because I'm thinking of like the protests. Like to me, when I think about what's
Mhm.
happening with racial
Yeah,
justice movement in this country,
they
it's
did
like a
talk about
flood
that.
of like something that was
Yeah.
sick
Yeah.
culturally is like
Right.
exploding in the
Right.
field. What
Well,
did they
no,
say about that?
they absolutely did talk about that. They talked about it in like multiple ways. Well, first of all, in a general sense, they very specifically talk about civil unrest.
Ah,
Like
wow.
they talk about the noise that well, in their mythology, there's like the older gods and the younger gods, and the younger gods were complaining. There was a lot of noise, you know, coming from them, and they would, like, you know, bust down the doors of like the older gods, their elders.
Mm,
um
scrappy
and
young things.
yeah, and so one of the things they did is they created humans as a result. This is their idea of why humans were created. Um, but that's another
Another story for another
big
time.
thing. Yeah, another
Yeah, I'm
story. But
curious about
the
that too.
point is, yeah, the point is, you know, it gives you some insight as to like what we were thinking about, like what we're actually doing here on the earth. And I really want to go into that, because if we can understand that, then we understand why all these things are happening, and
Yeah, so
we
let's
can
get into that.
understand how to change that. But you know, where to go in the future. But
Hmm.
but beside that, yeah, there was a general sense of noise, and you also find writings about um, a flood of people that basically they're talking about, like the Amorites or various other people who have, you know, basically flooded the area and taken
Mm.
over,
Mm.
um, you know, civilization. So they do talk about civil unrest
Yeah,
in that
interesting.
way.
Hmm.
Um, but so, and this is also, there is this concept of the gifts of civilization,
Hmm.
and these are things that just go along with civilization. They have an entire list of it, and one of them is the destruction of cities.
Hmm.
It's just in there.
Hmm.
um
Entropy.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's more than that. It's more than that, because this, I would say, is dynamic. And like in physics, dynamic means it's the result of forces in the system. You know,
Gotcha. Uh-huh.
it's
Yeah,
not just things
that's not natural
randomly.
decay, right?
Exactly, right.
Mhm.
So it's a little bit different. But yeah, so it's definitely there might be some natural decay in there, you know, because between systems of people, but it's not. It's like a focused thing. It's the result of certain processes that are happening that were involved in the structure of civilization, you
Yeah, I
know.
think the reason why I
That
said that, just to make it outside of my head, is when you were talking about entropy, something I was thinking about from the Dagara system, which is the West African spiritual system I studied. It's a 5 element system, but they have
mhm,
a different 5 elements. One of their elements is called nature, and nature is basically, so they have earth, water, fire, mineral, and nature. And nature is basically transformation and growth. And so that's
mhm.
a whole, they consider that an element. And when I think of that, I think of physics. And so when you were talking about entropy, I was thinking, oh, nature. And so then when you were saying, oh, yeah, it's kind of like a natural law of civilizations that this
Mhm,
happens, it just made
mhm.
me think back to that. Continue.
Ah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. So yeah, but to answer your question, yeah, it's, I mean, like they go in, they go at length to describe these things. These things are happening again. They're happening now. So it's very interesting. They struggled, really struggled with what it was, what, you know, what it was to live in
Mm-hmm.
civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and what it meant to be human. You know, why we're here. You know, what we were doing. And
When you say they, you mean ancient people kind of broadly,
ancient
or?
people, yeah, ancient
Yeah.
people broadly, yeah. But like my focus has been on, you know, tracking the group back to
The
you know, the early you know, the
Turkish.
Crescent Valley,
Mm-hmm.
Turkey, the Caucasus Mountains,
Mm-hmm.
because there were some groups that went north as well. Some
Mm-hmm.
groups went south, some groups went east, some groups went west. um, and
So did they get any answers that you would like to share
answers.
to the
What do you
questions?
mean?
What does it mean to be
What,
human, etc.?
oh yeah, I have many answers to those questions.
Or where were you going to go with it? It seems like you were going to go in a different direction.
Well, the thing is, we're it's kind of like, no, I will answer your question like roughly. Um, it's kind of like basically all of those different groups of, you know, humans were wiped out, and that's not unusual. Like if you there are different groups. There's Neanderthals, there's Denisovans, there's all these different groups of archaic humans that were interbreeding. This is from science. We have the evidence. So, and their conception was that there was a rich set of groups that could interbreed with Umanu, with humans, the craftsmen, and most of them were wiped out, which is also what we find from the anthropological record and the genetic studies, that they were basically wiped out. They didn't survive. They didn't make it. I can go into reasons, my suspicions of why that would be so. But the point is, like we can be distinguished from all of these other groups of people. And
you mean by not being wiped out?
Like our fundamental character is the tree of knowledge, of good and evil, like binary classification. Like we are able to be separated from each other and still communicate without telepathy, which is interesting. Most species, most animals, they get separated, they're just separate. But unless they have a coordinated way to like come back together. Our coordinated way is knowledge. I can say, I'm going to meet you here tomorrow at 1 p.m. and we can do that. We have a way to do that.
1:30 if it's us.
I kind of suspected. I suspected
about you too. So we co-suspected and
I know. We
via telepathy and both got our extra half hour to prepare.
That's right. It all worked out.
It worked out great.
So like, but the fundamental thing is agreement. Like in order to communicate, we have to be able to agree on what we're communicating. And that's why binary classification is so important, because that is the most effective way to agree. If I want to say, if I want to give you my location, the easiest way to give you my location is to say that, or if I want to identify an object in the room, I would be like this bottle is on the left side of the screen. So I'm dividing into two. And that's the easiest way to agree. If I said it was a third of the way through, you could be like, no, I think it's a quarter of the way through. And so if we classify things into like 4 pieces or 3 pieces, we're more likely to disagree.
Right. I got you.
So the binary classification and then our feelings about it, right or wrong, good or evil, true or false, these things play into our fundamental nature, which is why I believe it's so prominent. We ate from the tree of knowledge in our mythology, and that way of doing things is prevalent in everything we do, and it gives us insight into how we're operating. And this may be unpleasant to think about, but there are other things that also operate in a binary way, specifically computers. Okay. And really for the same exact reason, computers operate in a binary way, because that's the most effective way to have consistent storage of information, reliably stored information, so that different elements of memory can.
So what differentiates us from computers potentially is our capacity to participate with life technology, which they won't be able to do until the singularity is here.
Well, I'm very skeptical of that. I think that's like a much bigger discussion.
It is, yeah. I just had to be a little rabble rouser.
I'm not saying it's impossible, but I feel like you would have to have the technology would have to approach something more like biology in order to have access to life technology.
Like that show Upload. It's making me think of that. I love that show. Yeah. Did you watch all of it?
No, I only saw the one episode. It was hilarious.
Watching it.
I will. But so yeah, that's one of the aspects. But the interesting thing is computers are programmable.
Well,
You
so are
can
we. I
program.
mean, hello,
Exactly.
childhood trauma.
Exactly. Yeah, well, precisely. But no, but even with information, we're programmable. You
Right.
know,
Hmm.
we give us all this information is programming us, and that's fundamental to human beings. You know, from
Hmm.
the time we started creating like paintings on walls, it's part of the transfer of knowledge. You know, we are programming ourselves.
Hmm.
Um,
Wow, I
so
love that too, because I've been really thinking a lot about art making, and just I like that aspect, that lens to art making is kind of like programming, but not in a creepy way, more in like
yeah,
an energetic transmission
mm,
way. It really makes me think of what I want to put out there in my art too, like
yeah,
an epiphany or a moment of like joy versus I was just
mm,
reading Elizabeth Gilbert's book also today before we talked. So good, Big Magic, about creativity, and she was like making fun of the whole culture of like the tortured artist, and and there's like that was the way that so many artists engaged in creativity over the last, I don't know, century or whatever. Like it has to
mhm,
be painful, and there's like all these love songs that are like programming us with like dysfunctional attachment styles,
mhm,
that I grew up
yeah,
on. So
yeah.
to like put something out there that's the opposite of that. Continue.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there may be more to art than that, but
Oh
I'm
yeah, definitely.
yeah, yeah. Just pointing to the fact that that is definitely
Hey, your
like,
picture, your old
uh,
nerdy picture came on.
yeah, my battery life is going down.
Okay,
Uh,
we should, my P
we should wrap it
battery
up.
life is going down. So let's try to wrap it up in 10 minutes.
Okay,
Okay.
sure. Yeah, and so there could be like a whole nother discussion, like like what are humans, because we are like, there was a change in the form of humans around 10,000 BC. We are not, we don't even look or operate the way that there was a different distribution of humans.
I think
We're
this is an
we're
interesting topic, and it's making me think of Graham Hancock's research. I don't know if that's one of the people you've been reading. I know we talked about him
Yeah,
recently,
yeah,
but
it's very
I
interesting.
think what I'm wanting to do right now is go back to have you connect back into like when we first decided to talk about this, and if there
Mm.
was sort of an overlying message that you want to convey, if there's anything you had wanted to say that you haven't, that hasn't been like tied back up or come to yet.
Yeah, just that we once we understand, how we've been eating from the tree of knowledge and using death technology, the tree of death, we can begin to understand what this thing is, the tree of life, and we can maybe engage with those processes more effectively,
Mm-hmm.
and really integrate the ancient with the present,
Mm-hmm.
as we go into the future, because I think all of these things are at a place where they can be integrated. We don't need to rely as much on the kind of technology that we use right now, the
Yeah.
death technology. We can begin to incorporate other things, and that will be so much more fulfilling
Yeah.
and ultimately effective for
Yeah.
us to live peacefully, instead of just kind of separating out everybody and having uh, knowledge-based agreements, but actually having more intimate awareness, and
Yes,
being able
I
to work
totally agree, and I feel
along
like
those
I've
lines.
tasted that in various community settings that have been short term. We haven't been
Hmm.
able to sustain it over a long term, but it's very generative, and it does feel like a new kind of era, a new way of
Hmm.
being together.
Yeah, absolutely. And there will be many discoveries along the way.
Hmm.
Um, so it will be very interesting to see how things unfold.
Yeah. Um, I just had thought of the example I'll share quickly of like when all of the COVID stuff was like erupting and people were getting really fearful, like resources. And then I started, oh my gosh, what if we lose the internet? How are we going to communicate? And like my brother's in California with you and I'm here. So my brother and I have sibling ESP. Like we've both done enough psychedelics and like spiritual
Yeah.
stuff that we have that capacity to connect in when we set our intention. So we were like trying to make like a logistical backup plan for like, okay, if the phones and internets go out, what do we want to do? Should I drive across the country, or like, do we want to meet halfway in Utah, like this land that I have connections at? And we're like, oh, let's just set a time Saturday night at sunset to have sibling ESP and tune in and then like communicate, like, are we okay? Or like, where do we need to go? And, you know,
Right.
it's not like a fail-proof system with very specific, you know, a sentence that he's going to speak and I'll hear it. But it is like, we can tune in and feel like, oh, he's doing generally well, or he's kind of distracted, or like maybe we'll think of a certain thing together. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was hoping you would bring that up. I
Oh,
actually heard
really?
about
Oh,
this.
great.
Yeah, I heard about this from someone. I don't remember
Maybe
who.
you telepathically put that in the field then.
Because it is really like these kind of practices, I think will help us kind of reach more into less reliance on the tree of knowledge and more
Yeah.
on direct perception, which I think is so important. So
Yeah,
it's great
and
that
just
you're
to
doing
bring it
that.
into balance, because I love this death technology of Zoom and like making videos and stuff. It can be really fun, but when it's
Sure.
imbalanced, when I'm doing that for like so many hours a day and I'm getting all these EMFs and I'm not talking to a tree and discharging EMFs from my system and like
Hmm.
having my nervous system reset by like an organic life form, then I'm
Right.
an unhealthy person who's spun out, and the decisions I make are going to be coming from an imbalanced place and create more imbalance. And that's ultimately
Yeah.
why I'm
Yeah.
sitting here in Florida right now, not in Silicon Valley, because after 15 years in the Bay Area, it was snowballing where the decisions that I was making were creating more stress and more imbalance and more debt for me. Even though I
Yeah.
was successful and, you know, making a lot of money and paying a crazy rent, I was
Yeah.
living an indebted lifestyle, both financially and energetically. Like my kidneys
Mm.
were not they were not happy. I had adrenal fatigue. I was like tired.
Mm.
And here it's like, you know, there's the river and the palm trees and the swimming
Yeah.
pools
Yeah.
and the sunshine and everything's green. And it's just like
Yeah.
very
The
healthy,
life.
very organic. And it made me, when you're talking about the Nile, I was like, yeah, we have the Indian River here. It's this huge, it's got to be like a couple miles wide and like spans like multiple towns. And it's called the Indian River because the native people used to live by it. You know, that's where they settled, and it's like thriving. They could eat from it and they could bathe. And
Uh-huh.
my perspective, like post COVID, about what's valuable in a city, you know, I already had kind of been going towards learning these facets of like indigenous mind, where it's you see the world through a different lens, kind of like you were saying at the beginning of this call. And it's like, oh, it's more valuable to have a good tree that I can go pray at than a cool nightclub to go to on Saturday night, you know, with the right kind of people there or something. And so to
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
even after COVID, it's like that shifts even more towards like, what do I really value? My fucking mom, like being here with her and being in nature and being able to walk outside and feel safe and get fresh air and,
Mhm.
you know, anyhow.
Yeah,
Anyway.
this is absolutely, and it's really really the beginnings. I see that in my the way that I see things kind of unfolding is one of the key pieces is our health. When we see how our health is impacted, if it improves or it declines depending on the situation,
Right.
that's going to be a key piece. So healing is a critical piece of our unfoldment of our understanding of life technology. And so yeah, you put your finger on it. It's I think it's going to be it already is. Health and wellness is a big deal right now, but it's going to be taken to the next level. And we're beginning to understand that now because more people, I think, are either experiencing isolation or connecting more to nature or experiencing things in a way that becomes clear
Yeah,
and
it's
are
harder to dissociate from like fundamental health, physical
yeah,
or emotional
exactly.
imbalances when you're
Yeah.
quarantining alone in your apartment for 3 months or longer.
Yep.
All that
Yeah.
stuff gets pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And yeah, like when society starts falling away, then it's this opening where these other ideas of what it means to be healthy or successful, there's like more space to really feel like organically in my body what feels right. Because I know so many people that are just like focused on having a good career and making a lot of money so they can keep living in an expensive urban area. And their definition of success is like something along those lines. But it's also like, in my opinion, they're living, and I've been one of these people, living in an imbalanced way that's like not causing ultimate wellness for their heart, their body, their emotions, their spirit, or their relationships, or their connection to the spirit world, or their creative expression. And those are all like more of my values. And so I'm just super grateful personally that this shelter in place COVID time has created like a bridge for me to actually live in more alignment with those values.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it goes back to like civilization as well, and kind of, that the environment that we're in can really influence us. And like, as you said, like being more balanced. It's interesting, in Bali, they prioritize their spiritual practices like so high that they won't even go to work. Like they would rather just be poor, like have no money than sacrifice their.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I resonate with that too. Like my priority is having 3 hours in the morning to do my practices, and I can't really imagine having a 9-to-5 job. Luckily, when I have like training, and I'm a rich Western American who can be a coach and make lots of money. So
right. Yeah. And so it's challenging in Western society, especially in America. I can't speak for all the entire West, but it's challenging to do that unless you have the particular ability to do that. Like the circumstance that you have, where you set your own schedule, but when enough people do kind of what they're doing in Bali, where they prioritize their traditions, the time that they take to go to the temple, the time that they take to do these festivals, when everyone prioritizes that, then the entire system changes to accommodate that.
I love that you just said that. Go ahead.
Yeah, they the businesses operate around that. They don't sacrifice that. So
yeah, that's amazing. And I've never seen that in my life until COVID was the first time that I actually felt like society was reorganizing around my values, which is something organic. Like in this case, unfortunately, it was a virus that killed a lot of people and made a lot of people suffer. But to see like the US government is giving away money to help people, businesses are closing, like you could visually see this thing is happening. It's important. And like structure is responding to it. Whereas my life experience up until then was like very patriarchal, like there's this top down structure and it doesn't ever change for something that's like bottom up organic, which to me is like feels what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I think that's a pretty good conversation that
this was
had,
fun.
and hopefully we can do it again.
Let's do it again.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
So should we maybe press stop, or we can just like talk?
Yeah. I feel like I want a dramatic ending. What should it be?
A dramatic ending? I don't know. Yay!
Yay! Oh, how about this? Let's do the technology of the Zoom hug. So you hug yourself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's do that.
And then we send each other love.
Okay, I do like a bow. That's a good ending.
Thanks, friend. That was nice. I felt it.
All right. So should we call it a day?
Hang on. Let me hang on. I was trying to stop the recording, but I almost ended the meeting. Let me stop recording.